The Brides in the Bath Murders. Classification, Serial killer characteristics, Bigamist. Number of the victims, 3. Date of murders, 1912 to 1914. Date of arrest, February 1, 1915. Date of birth, January 11, 1872. Victims profile, Beatrice Bessie Mundy, 31, Alice Burnham, 25, Margaret Elizabeth Lofty, 38. Method of murder, drowning. Location, England. Status, executed by hanging at Maidstone Prison on August 13, 1915.
The Brides in the Bath Murders. George Joseph Smith, alias Oliver George Love, Charles Oliver James, Henry Williams and John Lloyd, was found guilty of the murders of Bessie Williams, née Mundy, who was found dead in a bath in 1912, Alice Burnham, who died in a bath at Blackpool in December 1913, and Margaret Elizabeth Lofty, who was found in a bath in Highgate in December 1914. It was significant that when the case was under investigation, Divisional Detective Inspector Neil formed the opinion along with the pathologist Dr. Bernard Spilsbury that it would be impossible for anyone to accidentally drown in any of the baths in question. On July 13, 1912, Bessie Williams was found dead in her bath at 80 High Street, Herne Bay. It was ascertained that 5 days before her death she had made a will in favor of her husband, Henry Williams, alias George Joseph Smith, by which he benefited to the amount of £2,579, 13 shillings and 7 pence. Smith was questioned closely, but the opinion of the doctor who examined Bessie at the time of her death apparently convinced the jury. Dr. Frank French said he believed she had had an epileptic fit, and thought the cause of death had been asphyxia brought about by drowning. Asked if he had seen any signs of a struggle on the body, he replied that he had seen none. The last question at the inquest was whether the death had been due to anything else other than drowning. The doctor replied, "I have no reason to suspect any other cause than drowning." The jury did not wish for a post-mortem and returned a verdict of death by misadventure. The death of Alice Smith on 12 December 1913 saw George Joseph Smith at work again. Alice's father had severe doubts about his prospective son-in-law, describing him during the engagement as being of very evil appearance, and yet the marriage went ahead nonetheless. On the evening of her death, Alice went for a bath at the apartments, owned by Mr. and Mrs. Crossley, where she and her husband were staying, and never returned. Joseph Crossley noted when her body was found sometime later that her head was at the foot of the bath. The inquest held on the 13th December returned the verdict that Alice had accidentally drowned through heart failure when in the bath. Alice, it transpired, had insured herself for £500. Life insurance was also the death warrant for Margaret Elizabeth Lloyd, née Lofty. John Lloyd, otherwise known as George Joseph Smith, took rooms with his wife in a boarding house at 14 Bismarck Road, in Highgate, London. On the afternoon of December 18, 1914, Margaret Lloyd had visited her solicitor in Islington and made a will in favor of her husband. Later that evening, John Lloyd told the owner of the house that he was going out to buy some tomatoes for his wife's supper whilst she took a bath. When he returned, he called out to his wife and, getting no answer, entered the bathroom and found her dead in a bath. The inquest took place on the 1st of January 1915 and a verdict of accidental death was recorded. When the hearse drew up at the funeral, Smith told the undertaker Herbert Francis Beckett, "I don't want any walking, get it over as quick as you can," and after the funeral was over he was heard to say, "Thank goodness. That's all over." On January 3, 1915, Joseph Crossley wrote to the Metropolitan Police and enclosed a newspaper cutting about the death of Margaret Lloyd, remarking how similar it was to the death of Alice Smith 12 months previously in Blackpool. Thus started the downfall of Smith. Upon investigation, the details of Smith's sinister life emerged. George Joseph Smith had been born in Bethnal Green on the 11th of January 1872. In 1898 he married Caroline Beatrice Thornhill. In 1908 he married Edith Pegler, in the name of Oliver George Love, although his first wife was still alive. In 1910, when he married Bessie Mundy, Edith Pegler was still alive. From that moment, murder and money took over his life. Divisional Detective Inspector Neil stopped Smith on the 1st of February 1915 in Uxbridge Road in London. On the 8th February Smith appeared at Bow Street Police Court and was remanded till the 15th of February. He was initially charged with causing a false entry to Maid in a marriage register, but the ensuing inquiries revealed the darker side of the case. On the 23rd March he was charged with the murders of Bessie Williams, Alice Smith, and Margaret Lloyd. He was eventually found guilty and sentenced to death. He was executed at Maidstone jail on August 13, 1915. Charles Matthews, Director of Public Prosecutions, wrote on the 1st of July 1915 to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police concerning Divisional Detective Inspector Neil, "I feel I ought not to allow any interval of time to pass without expressing the acknowledgment which in my opinion, the administration of justice is under to Divisional Detective Inspector Neil, and to the officers who serve under him, for their untiring, able, zealous, and intelligent efforts, which played so conspicuous a part in securing the conviction which was this day obtained of the above-named malefactor. Under ordinary circumstances the investigation would have been conducted by a chief inspector from the Commissioner's office, but it was felt that Neil had so much ability it was better to leave the case his hands. The case was an intricate one, and it is alarming to imagine how far Smith may have gone had Crossley not written the letter which led to his downfall. George Joseph Smith, January 11, 1872, August 13, 1915, was an English serial killer and bigamist. In 1915 he was convicted and subsequently hanged for the slayings of 3 women, the case becoming known as the Brides in the Bath murders. As well as being widely reported in the media, the case was a significant case in the history of forensic pathology and detection. It was also one of the first cases in which similarities between connected crimes were used to prove a deliberation, a technique used in subsequent prosecutions. Early life. The son of an insurance agent, George Joseph Smith was born in Bethnal Green. He was sent to a reformatory at Gravesend at the age of 9 and later had served time for swindling and theft. In 1896 he was imprisoned for 12 months for persuading a woman to steal from her employers. He used the proceeds to open a baker's shop in Leicester. It was perhaps his last brush with legitimate work. In 1898 he married Caroline Beatrice Thornhill, under another alias, Oliver George Love, in Leicester. It was his only legal marriage, although he also married another woman bigamously in 1899. They moved to London where she worked as a maid for a number of employers, stealing from them for her husband. She was eventually caught in Worthing, and sentenced to 12 months. On her release she incriminated her husband, and he was imprisoned for 2 years in January 1901. On his release, Mrs. Love fled to Canada. Smith then went back to his other wife, cleared out her savings, and left. It is unknown how many women he treated in this manner in the years following. What is known is that in June 1908 Smith married a widow from Worthing, Florence Wilson. On 3rd of July he left her, but not before taking £30 drawn from her savings account and selling her belongings from their Camden residence. Then on 30th of July he married Edith Pegler in Bristol, who replied to an advertisement for a housekeeper. He would disappear for months at a time, saying that he would go to another city to ply his trade, which he claimed to be selling antiques. In between his other marriages, Smith would always come back to Edith with money. In October 1909, under the name George Rose Smith, he married Sarah Freeman. As with Florence Wilson, he left her after clearing out her savings and selling her war bonds with a total take of £400. It was after this that he married Bessie Mundy, and Alice Burnham after that. And between Alice Burnham and Margaret Lofty, in September 1914 he married Alice Reed, under the alias Charles Oliver James. And all between 1908 to 1914 Smith entered into 7 bigamous marriages. And in most of these cases Smith was content to go through his wife's possessions before he disappeared. 2 similar deaths. One evening in January 1915 Division Detective Inspector Arthur Neal received a letter from a Joseph Crossley, who owned a boarding house in Blackpool. together with a letter were two newspaper clippings. One was from the News of the World dated before Christmas 1914, about a tragic death of Margaret Elizabeth Lloyd, née Lofty, aged 38, who died in her lodgings in 14 Bismarck Road, Highgate. She was found in her bathtub by her husband, John Lloyd, and their landlady. The other clipping contained the report of a coroner's inquest dated December 13, 1913, in Blackpool. It was about a woman named Alice Smith, née Burnham, who died suddenly in a boarding house in that city while taking a bath in her bathtub. She was found by her husband George Smith. The letter, dated January 3, was written by Crossley, the landlord of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, on behalf of Crossley's wife and a Mr. Charles Burnham, who both expressed their suspicion on the striking similarity of the two incidents and urged the police to investigate the matter.
The hunt. Inspector Neil went to 14 Bismarck Road where Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd had taken lodgings on 17th of December. The landlady found it peculiar that before they took the room, Mr. Lloyd examined the bathroom first. The bathtub was 50 inches long and 66 inches at the top. Neil found it hard to believe that an adult like Mrs. Lloyd could have drowned in such a small tub, especially since the tub was 3/4 full when Mrs. Lloyd was found. He then went to the coroner, a Dr. Bates, who signed the death certificate, and cautiously asked if there were signs of violence on the woman. There were none, except for a tiny bruise above the left elbow. However, what was striking about the whole thing was that Mr. Lloyd had not shown any grief, and ordered the cheapest coffin for his late bride. Upon further investigation, Neil was able to learn that a will was made on the 18th, 3 hours before Margaret Lloyd died, and the sole beneficiary was none other than Mr. Lloyd, and the latter submitted the will to a solicitor for settlement. In addition, Mrs. Lloyd withdrew all her savings also on that day. On 12th of January, Dr. Bates called. He had an inquiry for the Yorkshire Insurance Company about the death of Margaret Lloyd. She had, 3 days before she was married, taken out a life insurance policy for £700, with her husband John Lloyd as sole beneficiary. Neil promptly asked the doctor to stall in his reply. At once he asked for more data on the Smith case from the Blackpool police. Mrs. Smith likewise took out a life insurance policy and made a will in her husband's favor, and took the lodgings in Blackpool only after Mr. Smith inspected the bathtub. Convinced that he was now dealing with the same man, Neil asked the coroner to issue a favorable report to the insurance company. He was counting on the man to get in touch with his solicitor, and he had the office watched day and night. At last, on 1st of February, a man fitting Lloyd/Smith's description appeared. Inspector Neil introduced himself and asked him whether he was John Lloyd. "Yes," replied the man. Then Neil asked him whether he was also George Smith. The man vehemently denied it. Inspector Neil, already sure that John Lloyd and George Smith were the same man, told him that he would take him for questioning because of bigamy. The man finally admitted that he was indeed George Smith. Neil guessed that Smith made that admission because he would rather admit to having committed bigamy than murder. In any case, Smith was under arrest. Spilsbury enters the case. When Smith was arrested for the charge of bigamy and suspicion of murder, the renowned pathologist Bernard Spilsbury was asked to determine how the women died. Although he was the Home Office pathologist and acted mainly in a consulting capacity, he was also available for direct assistance to the police force. Margaret Lloyd's body was exhumed, and Spilsbury's first task was to confirm drowning as the cause of death, if so whether it by accident or force. He confirmed the tiny bruise on the elbow as noted before, as well as 2 microscopic marks. Even the evidence of drowning was not extensive. There were no signs of heart or circulatory disease, but the evidence suggested that death was almost instantaneous, as if the victim died of a sudden stroke. Poison was also seen as a possibility, and Spilsbury ordered tests on its presence. Finally, he proposed to Neil that they run some experiments in the very same bathtub in which Margaret died. Neil had it set up in the police station. Despite the exhumation being carried out as discreetly as possible, the press got wind of it and stories about the brides in the baths began to appear. On 8 February, the Chief of Police of Herne Bay, a small seaside resort in Kent, had read the stories, and sent Neil a report of another death which was strikingly similar to the other two. A third victim. A year before Alice Burnham's death in Blackpool, one Henry Williams had rented a house in 80 High Street, with no bath for himself and his wife Beatrice Bessie Mundy, whom he married in Weymouth in 1910. He then rented a bathtub 7 weeks later. He then took his wife to local doctor, Frank French, due to supposed attack of epilepsy, although Mrs. Williams was only complaining of headaches, to which the doctor prescribed some medication. On July 12, 1912, Mr. Williams woke up Dr. French, saying that his wife was having another attack. He checked on her and promised to come back the following afternoon. However, he was surprised when, on the following morning, he was informed by Mr. Williams that his wife had died of drowning. The doctor found Bessie Williams in the tub, her head underwater, her legs stretched out straight and her feet protruding out of the water. There was no trace of violence, so Dr. French attributed the drowning to an attack of epilepsy. The inquest jury was apparently convinced and awarded Mr. Williams the amount of £2,579.137, as stipulated in Mrs. Williams' will, made up 5 days before her death. Neil then sent photographs of Smith to Herne Bay for possible identification and went to Blackpool where Spilsbury was conducting an autopsy of Alice Williams. Again, the results are the same, as with Margaret Lloyd, the lack of violence, every suggestion of instantaneous death, little evidence of drowning. Furthermore, there were no traces of poison on Margaret Lloyd. Baffled, Spilsbury routinely took measurements of the corpse and had the tub sent to London. Back in London, Neil had received confirmation from Herne Bay. Henry Williams was the same man as John Lloyd and George Smith. This time, when Spilsbury examined Bessie Williams, he found one sure sign of drowning, the presence of goosebumps on the skin. As with the other two deaths, the tub where Mrs. Williams died was sent to London. Solution. For weeks Spilsbury pondered over the bathtubs and the victim's measurements. Supposing, he thought, that Bessie Williams had indeed had an epileptic fit. Its first stage consists of a stiffening and extension of the entire body. Considering her height, 5 feet 7 inches, and the length of the tub, 5 feet, the upper part of her body would have been pushed up the sloping head of the tub, far above the level of the water. The second stage would consist of violent spasms of the limbs, which were drawn up to the body and then flung outward. Therefore, no one of her size could possibly get underwater, especially when her muscles would relax on third stage. The tub was simply too small. Suddenly, he hit upon a possible solution. Using Dr. French's description of Bessie Williams when he found her in the bathtub, Spilsbury reasoned that Smith, under the pretense of a lover's teasing, must have seized Bessie by the feet and suddenly pulled them up toward himself, sliding the upper part of the body underwater. The sudden flood of water into her nose and throat might cause shock and sudden loss of consciousness. This would explain the absence of injuries and minimal signs of drowning. To try out Spilsbury's theory, Neil hired several experienced women divers of the same size and build as the victims. He tried to push them underwater by force, but there would be inevitable signs of struggle. Finally, Neil did what Spilsbury had suggested. He unexpectedly pulled the feet of one of the divers, and her head glided underwater before she knew what was happened. Suddenly Neil was alarmed when he saw that the woman was no longer moving. He quickly pulled her out of the tub and it took him and a doctor over half an hour before they were able to revive her. When she came to, she related that the only thing she remembered was the rush of water before she lost consciousness. This despite the fact that she expected the attack and was an experienced diver. Thus was Spilsbury's theory confirmed. George Joseph Smith was charged for the murders of Bessie Williams, Alice Smith and Margaret Lloyd on March 23, 1915. Trial and legal legacy. On June 22, he went on trial at the Old Bailey. The prosecuting counsel were Archibald Bodkin, later Director of Public Prosecutions, and Cecil Whiteley, later KC. Although he could only be tried for the murder of Bessie Williams in accordance with English law, the prosecution used the deaths of the other two to establish the pattern of Smith's crimes. This was allowed by Mr. Justice Scott and despite the protests of Smith's counsel, Sir Edward Marshall Hall. Smith decided not to give evidence in his own defense, indicating this to Marshall Hall in a handwritten note. It took the jury about 20 minutes on 1 July to find him guilty and he was sentenced to death. Smith's appeal against his verdict and sentence was dismissed, and on 13 August, Smith was hanged in Maidstone prison by John Ellis. The use of system, comparing other crimes to the one a criminal is being tried for to prove guilt, set a precedent that was later used in other murder trials. For example, the doctor and suspected serial killer John Bodkin Adams was charged for the murder of Edith Alice Morrell, but the deaths of Gertrude Hewlett and her husband Jack were used in the committal hearing to prove the existence of a pattern. This use of system was later criticized by the trial judge when Adams was only tried on the Morrell charge. Popular culture. In his book Why Britain is at War, Harold Nicolson used the behavior of George Smith and his repeatedly murderous behavior as a parallel to Hitler's repeatedly acquisitive behavior in Europe in the 1930s.